The most terrifying part of World War II was not the battles. It was how ordinary life slowly accepted the unimaginable. This is not a story of victory, but of how humanity was lost before the war was won. Before the first bombs fell, and before the world learned new names for fear, life across Europe still moved in familiar rhythms. Streets were busy. Cafes were open. Children walked to school. And newspapers spoke of politics as distant arguments rather than approaching disasters. Few understood that history was already shifting beneath their feet. The transformation did not arrive all at once. It crept forward quietly, disguised as order, stability, and national pride. New slogans appeared on walls. New laws were announced over radios. Ordinary people were told that sacrifice was necessary, that unity required obedience, and that certain neighbors were suddenly dangerous. Discrimination became routine before it became violent. Shops changed ownership. Professions were restricted. Families who had lived in the same neighborhoods for generations found doors slowly closing to them. Many witnessed this transformation in silence, convincing themselves it was temporary or that it was not their responsibility to intervene. When war finally erupted, it did not resemble the heroic visions promised by speeches. Soldiers marched through cities not as liberators, but as reminders that power had changed hands. Flags replaced familiar symbols, and foreign languages echoed through streets that once felt safe. Occupation reshaped daily life. Curfews controlled movement. Food became scarce. Rumors traveled faster than facts. Every knock on the door carried uncertainty, and trust between neighbors began to erode as survival demanded caution over compassion. Entire families were uprooted with little warning. They were given minutes to pack what remained of their lives into small bags. Homes were abandoned, not knowing whether they would ever be seen again. The journey ahead was unclear, but fear was certain. Transportation became a weapon of control. Crowded trains carried people away from familiar places toward unknown destinations. The sound of doors locking echoed louder than any explanation, and the world outside faded into darkness as the journey continued. Arrival did not bring clarity. Barbed wire, watchtowers, and shouted orders replaced any remaining sense of humanity. Names were taken away and replaced with numbers. Identity was reduced to survival, measured day by day. Inside the camps, time lost meaning. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear shaped every moment. Yet even in these conditions, small acts of kindness survived: a shared piece of bread, a whispered word of encouragement, a refusal to forget what it meant to be human. Children were not spared by the war's cruelty. Childhood vanished early, replaced by responsibility, fear, and loss. Many learned to remain silent, to observe carefully, and to survive in a world that no longer protected the innocent. Beyond the camps, the war expanded across vast territories. On the Eastern Front, the conflict became a struggle against nature itself. Winters were merciless. Soldiers fought not only enemies, but cold, hunger, and exhaustion that claimed lives without warning. Civilians, trapped between advancing armies, endured unimaginable hardship. Cities under siege were slowly starved. Food rations shrank to almost nothing, and survival depended on endurance rather than hope. Hunger reshaped both bodies and morality. In many occupied regions, forced labor became another instrument of control. Men, women, and even teenagers were sent to work under constant supervision. Long hours, poor nutrition, and harsh punishment were routine, designed to break both body and spirit. War also spread far beyond Europe. Across Asia, military occupation transformed everyday life. Civilians learned to move carefully, speak less, and obey quickly. Resistance, whether real or imagined, often resulted in brutal consequences. Air power brought destruction from above. Sirens shattered the silence of cities as bombs fell without discrimination. Homes, hospitals, and shelters were destroyed in moments, leaving civilians to search for safety where none truly existed. When the bombing stopped, survivors emerged into landscapes unrecognizable. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Smoke lingered in the air, and the silence that followed was often heavier than the noise that came before it. As the war dragged on, fear reshaped human behavior. Many learned to look away, to remain silent, to prioritize survival over resistance. Acts of cruelty were often accompanied by acts of quiet compliance, leaving moral wounds that would last long after the fighting ended. Gradually, the balance shifted. Armies advanced, territories were reclaimed, and long-held positions collapsed. For those imprisoned or displaced, rumors of liberation spread cautiously, carried by whispers rather than certainty. Liberation did not erase suffering. Survivors emerged, weakened, traumatized, and uncertain of what remained of their former lives. Freedom arrived alongside grief, as many discovered that families, homes, and entire communities were gone. As the war approached its end, celebrations filled streets across many nations. Flags waved and crowds gathered. But beneath the joy lay exhaustion and remembrance. Victory came at a cost measured not only in territory, but in human lives. When the fighting finally stopped, silence spread across the ruins of cities and villages. Weapons were lowered, but the damage left behind could not be undone. Roads led home for some, but for many, there was no home left to return to. Survivors began the slow process of rebuilding their lives. Some searched for family members whose fates were unknown. Others attempted to reclaim identities that had been stripped away. The war ended on paper, but its presence remained in memories and scars. The world demanded accountability. Trials were held, testimonies recorded, and crimes brought into the open. For the first time, suffering that had been hidden behind walls and barbed wire was spoken aloud before the world. Yet justice could not restore what was lost. Millions of lives had ended without graves or names. Families were fractured, cultures scarred, and entire generations carried trauma that would shape the decades to come. Children who survived the war grew into adults shaped by absence. Their memories were filled with hunger, fear, and sudden silence. Many carried these experiences quietly, passing them on only through stories and glances that words could not fully explain. As nations rebuilt, the memory of the war slowly transformed into history. Museums were built, anniversaries observed, and lessons debated. The danger was no longer bombs, but forgetting how easily ordinary life had once descended into darkness. The darkest chapters of the war were not written only by those who commanded armies, but also by moments of silence, indifference, and obedience. The line between good and evil proved thinner than many had believed. Remembering the war is not about glorifying violence or victory. It is about recognizing suffering, honoring those who endured it, and understanding the responsibility that comes with freedom and choice. The ruins eventually faded, but the warnings remained. History showed how quickly fear could become policy, how easily neighbors could become enemies, and how fragile peace truly was. The Second World War ended decades ago, but its shadows still stretch into the present. Remembering its darkest moments is not an act of sorrow alone, but a responsibility to remain vigilant, humane, and unwilling to repeat what once seemed unthinkable.